Welcome to Module 1. This module will focus on exploring the listening strand of the FSL curriculum documents in order to develop language proficiency and confidence for learners. This module will address possible barriers present for educators and learners while participating in listening activities. It will also discuss concrete instructional strategies that will help learners develop listening and interaction skills.
There are 4 key goals for this module. First, we are examining the importance of listening so that we can support learners in developing confidence to become effective communicators. Second, we are identifying possible challenges present for educators and learners while participating in listening activities so that we can overcome these barriers to increase engagement and confidence. Third, we are exploring pre-listening, during listening, and post-listening instructional strategies so that we can support learners in understanding and interpreting a variety of spoken French texts and conversations. Finally, we are describing ways that promote equity, diversity, inclusion, and culturally responsive and relevant pedagogy in listening so that we can help educators meet the needs of learners and critically choose authentic texts that represent diverse voices of la francophonie.
Well-developed listening skills in French are essential for learners' development of language proficiency. French language learners need to develop listening skills for a variety of purposes, including their interactions with others, comprehension of classroom presentations, radio or television broadcasts, or audiobooks, numerous other social and school purposes. Daily opportunities to practice listening is of utmost importance in the development of listening skills. Listening comprehension is a complex, multi-level process that involves a number of skills, from recognizing a speech signal to comprehending meaning. Listening and speaking come hand in hand. Listening is integral in oral interactions in order to effectively communicate. Learners need to be exposed to diverse listening opportunities from various sources to build oral proficiency. Listening is the first strand in the FSL elementary and secondary curriculum documents, and is composed of 3 overall expectations. A1, listening to understand. A2, listening to interact. And A3, intercultural understanding. The curriculum documents provide educators with prompts after each specific expectation that consist of suggested questions that can be asked to learners to aid them in their listening development. Instructional tips are also provided to guide educators in effective instructional strategies that are appropriate for different grades and proficiency levels and become more complex progressing through each grade. For example, an instructional tip for grade 5 core French under the specific expectation A2.2 interacting encourages educators to model ways of giving feedback to a peer, including the use of various question and answer formats. For example, using est que, the inversion, and incorporating the question in the answer. This learning is advanced through the grades. In grade 9 core French, an instructional tip for A2.2 is that educators can encourage social interaction by providing opportunities for learners to react to and express themselves on familiar topics. In grade 5, learners can gain success in this expectation when the task is more educator directed, whereas in grade 9, more independence is placed on the learner in collaborative settings when interacting with peers. The central importance of oral communication and the need to explicitly teach listening is that oral comprehension precedes oral production, and that a variety of input is critical in establishing a solid foundation for language learning. In other words, language production begins with listening. Learners need to be exposed to a variety of authentic listening opportunities to develop their listening skills, which is a foundation for language development.
On this slide, you will notice the graphics from Grammar in Action that highlight the important role that listening and speaking play for early language learners in building competency and fluency. As noted in the FSL curriculum, if learners hear it, they can say it. If learners can say it, they can read it. And if learners can read it, they can write it. Listening is therefore a foundational skill that must be explicitly taught. Educators can use the descriptors in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages to be able to better understand how listening skills develop as learners gain more language proficiency. The progression of the development of language learning skills in the FSL curriculum documents is connected to the language proficiency level of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. CEFR descriptors for listening can help educators plan listening activities with intention and based on the learner's language level. For instance, for listening skills, an A1 language learner can understand simple words and phrases like the days of the week, numbers, prices, and basic descriptions of people and objects. An A2 learner can understand simple information and questions about their immediate surroundings, family, people, home, work, and hobbies, and can understand enough of what people say to be able to meet immediate needs. A B1 learner can understand the main points of clear standard speech on familiar everyday subjects, provided there is an opportunity to get repetition or clarification sometimes. They can identify both general messages and specific details, provided people speak clearly in a familiar accent. A learner who can understand the main ideas of complex speech on concrete and abstract topics is a B2 level for listening. Visit the CFR Listening Skills Continuum in the Viewer's Guide to see the descriptions for all levels. It is important to start with empathy and understanding in order to effectively engage with listening activities and meet the needs of all of our learners. As educators, it can at times be a challenge to find appropriate content and levels for texts, and learners might react with resistance to listening to Francophone speakers with different accents than those to which they are accustomed to hearing. This is a natural reaction because listening is a difficult skill. Listening is often presented in a way that learners feel they are being tested. Since the pace or speed of oral text is controlled by the speaker and not the listener, it adds to the cognitive demands of processing and making meaning placed on learners. As well, oral texts are often less linear, especially in informal, spontaneous contexts, and topics can be less predictable. It is important to regularly practice listening as an active skill to build learner confidence in understanding what is heard with a variety of texts, such as recordings, announcements, advertisements, etc., and when interacting to respond appropriately in conversations. There are several factors that influence the difficulty level of oral text for learners. Listening to Learn from Transforming FSL explores these barriers using the dials of difficulty pictured on this slide. This document identifies 6 factors that can influence the learner's engagement and confidence with the listening task: the topic and complexity of the text, the accent and pace of the speaker, and the purpose for listening and supports available during a listening task. Visit the Viewer's Guide for the link to Listening to Learn, which explores each of these key factors in detail. With careful planning and attention to these barriers, educators can better support learners to become confident listeners. All language learners, regardless of experience and language level, need practice developing listening skills to overcome these barriers. In Chapter 5 of Access for Success, Katie Arnett and Renee Berguen remind us that although we often associate the need to develop comprehension and listening strategies with beginning language learners, more fluent speakers also need to continue building comprehension. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider these questions. What barriers have you noticed in your professional practice that impact learners in engaging with listening? How can you view these barriers from an asset-based approach in order to take action to meet the needs of learners?
For effective learning to happen in listening, it is essential that educators create a safe, inclusive, and positive listening environment for all learners. Learners need to feel safe in the learning environment in order to build their confidence and take risks. Educators can establish norms to demonstrate that attentive listening is valued. For instance, respect for the speaker can be demonstrated by being aware of cultural norms, such as by not slouching and having a welcoming body posture, by facing the speaker, by not speaking when the speaker is talking, and by showing genuine interest in what the speaker has to say. Educators can also model curiosity and an open minded attitude, in that the focus on listening is not about assessment, but exposure to language for personal growth. Educators can connect learning to the community and the world by making personal connections and by making learning relevant when introducing topics and concepts that connect learning to issues that learners perceive as interesting and important in their daily lives. Educators can teach listening skills using the gradual release of responsibility model by providing learners with the tools they need to take ownership and succeed in language learning by gaining independence. This starts with educators modeling effective practices to learners through direct instruction. Then, educators engage learners in guided practice and collaborative learning by providing differentiated support. The end result is for learners to develop agency through independent practice, whereby they have access to the tools and strategies they need to be successful at a task and can apply their knowledge in a variety of contexts. Listening is arguably the most important skill required for obtaining comprehensible input in one's first and any subsequent languages. It is a pervasive communicative event. We listen considerably more than we read, write, or speak. For learners to develop effective listening skills, educators should model and support learners with pre listening, during listening, and post listening strategies. The front matter of the FSL curriculum documents states that once learners are consciously aware of strategies, have practiced using them, can select the most effective ones for a particular task, and can see the link between their own actions and their learning, they will be able to monitor their use of the strategies, set goals for improvement, and become more motivated and more effective French language learners. Explicit instruction that supports learners in selecting and using pre listening, during listening, and post listening strategies are integral in fostering a learner focused environment. For this next section of the module, we will illustrate each phase of listening by using the example of a task that involves listening to a dialogue in a restaurant. In this example, learners are working towards an oral interaction where they order a meal for themselves in French. The success criteria will include: je peux commander la nourriture, je peux répondre aux questions, and je peux utiliser les formes de politesse.
To support learners with pre listening, educators need to speak French daily in class. They can use gestures to support understanding and so that learners can practice making meaning. Pre listening activities prepare the learner by getting them interested in the topic, activating their prior knowledge, and giving them the tools to help process what they will hear. When starting a listening activity, it is important to provide an intention for listening and to share that goal with learners. For example, what is the purpose of the listening task? Consider how to activate prior knowledge or provide activities that pre-teach vocabulary or structures that learners do not yet know. It may also be necessary to make learners aware of sound differences or vocabulary differences before listening to an accent with which they are unfamiliar. All of these things will help learners approach listening with more confidence. There are various activities and tools that educators can use as part of the pre-listening phase. This slide highlights possible opportunities to assist educators with setting up pre-listening activities that will support learners with this phase. For instance, educators can use images or create discussion questions related to the topic of the listening task as a way to set the context and generate interest. To activate prior knowledge connected to a task, educators can use a KWL chart or a mind map with learners. Presenting images or watching the video with the sound off and having learners predict what they think the listening activity will be about allows learners to get ready for what they are about to hear and provides exposure to key vocabulary. Giving time to look over the graphic organizer or questions being used during listening allows learners to make connections to the listening intention for the task so they can focus their listening for a specific purpose. For example, before listening to the restaurant dialogue, educators start with a discussion question, asking learners to share Qu'est-ce que tu préfères manger? Or Où aimes-tu manger? With images to choose from. A pre-listening activity such as this allows educators to gather information on what vocabulary learners already know about food. Giving choice for learners and visual prompts provides different entry points of engagement and connects to learner interests. Another pre-listening activity option might be to use a KWL chart of ordering at a restaurant. Educators can capture what learners already know and what they wonder about ordering at a restaurant, such as salutations, forms of politeness, and food vocabulary. A KWL chart allows educators to value the knowledge learners bring to the activity and see where new learning can happen.
In order to support learners during listening, educators can explore a variety of strategies. Educators can create a positive social environment for listening by ensuring that a climate of respect is established. This can be done by modeling appropriate listening behavior, reviewing listening etiquette, and ensuring positive behavior is displayed by listeners. Educators can ensure that the listening activity is purposeful and that the learning goal of the activity aligns with curriculum expectations. Educators should engage learners in a range of listening activities. Some examples of authentic listening activities for learners include inside outside circles, graffiti, quick writes, and tableau. Consult the glossary for a description of these activities. In addition, it is important for educators to explicitly teach and model appropriate strategies to learners during listening. Here are some during listening strategies that educators can model for learners. Listen with attention by focusing on the speaker or speakers. Listen for familiar words and words that are similar to other languages, as well as keywords to determine the topic. Observe facial expression, body gestures, and objects for clues. Listen for sounds, such as music or sound effects, to inform comprehension. Use a graphic organizer or take notes to record information and make inferences on what is heard. Listen more than one time to monitor and check for comprehension, if possible. Educators need to model these strategies and others to learners so that they understand how these strategies can help in listening. In the restaurant example, a during listening activity can involve having learners complete a quick write or a graphic organizer. Educators can create specific prompts for learners to respond to based on the dialogue. For instance, for each listen, learners can accomplish a specific task. For the first listen, learners can identify what food and drink the client ordered. For the second listen, learners can point out whether the client was satisfied with the meal and why or why not. For the third listen, learners can indicate how much the meal cost and how the client paid. During a fourth listen to the dialogue, educators could extend the listening intention to include identifying examples of expressions used to convey politeness during the conversation to highlight sociolinguistic conventions for the learner. Learners can share their responses in partners or small groups to identify common understandings and misconceptions.
Post-listening activities are important to extend learners' listening skills. Providing opportunities for learners to discuss what they heard is an important piece of developing listening comprehension skills. Educators can have learners share what they heard with a partner or small group before taking it up with the whole class. After the opportunity to discuss with peers, educators can replay the listening passage to allow learners to improve their comprehension and deepen their understanding. Beyond simply checking for accuracy with listening, post-listening activities provide an opportunity to delve into the text in more detail and to use details from the text as a springboard for other activities such as speaking, reading, and writing. For instance, a listening text can be used as a model for specific vocabulary or language structures that learners need to achieve for a particular communication goal in an authentic, action-oriented task. In the restaurant scenario for a post-listening activity, educators can have learners complete the L portion of the KWL chart to reflect on new vocabulary or expressions that were learned during the listening task and share their learning in small groups with a partner or by using a thinking routine such as think, pair, share. These new expressions can be added to an anchor chart for classroom use. Or, to go deeper into the oral text, educators can provide a transcription of the dialogue and have learners highlight useful phrases that they could use toward their action-oriented task at the end of the learning cycle, connected to the success criteria Je peux commander la nourriture, Je peux répondre aux questions, and Je peux utiliser les formes de politesse. Supporting learners with metacognition and goal setting is an important part of post-listening activities. Learners benefit from discussions about the use of French language learning strategies so that they can practice them and start thinking critically about selecting the best strategies for specific tasks. As they start to monitor their own use of strategies and set goals for improvement, they become more engaged and confident in their learning. Educators can help learners develop independence by having them track their progress towards a goal on a regular basis and identify the next steps in the process. Educators can support these discussions by asking learners to list listening strategies used in order of effectiveness for the task, or evaluate the effectiveness of their listening strategies. They could decide which strategy will be most helpful in similar contexts, or discuss their challenges recalling information and which strategies will address these challenges. Providing sentence stems, like the ones on this slide, and using anchor charts with listening strategies listed will also support learners with having these discussions in French. See the viewer's guide for some useful resources to support learners with discussing listening strategies.
At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider these questions. Which pre, during, and post listening strategies and activities are you already implementing in your professional practice? Which strategies and activities would you like to start implementing based on learners' needs, and why? It is important to expose learners to listening opportunities using diverse resources. When choosing resources to share with learners, connect listening to culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy by considering the diverse identities of learners in the classroom and the opportunities to build cultural competence and critical consciousness. The front matter of the FSL curriculum documents outlines the importance of learning about different cultures in the world. The documents state, to develop their listening and interaction skills, French language learners need extensive daily opportunities to listen to people's opinions on, discuss, and reflect on a range of subjects, including personally relevant topics, school subjects, and current affairs. The development of intercultural understanding is included in each of the 4 strands of the FSL curriculum documents. In the listening strand, the overall expectation, A3, is specific to intercultural understanding. Selecting authentic materials to use with learners provides an opportunity to look at other ways of doing things and seeing different ways of thinking to become better global citizens through the development of intercultural competencies. Here are some considerations to keep in mind when selecting authentic resources for listening tasks. It is important to have a representation of diverse francophone voices in the world. Speakers of la francophonie need to be representative of a variety of identities, such as coming from different geographical regions, family structures, physical abilities, and gender identities. To be engaging for learners, age-appropriate material is important in order to showcase children and adolescents of similar ages speaking French. The content of the oral texts need to be appropriate in that there is positive messaging for all learners. For instance, consider how a culture is being represented and if there are any discriminatory biases that may be present before showing a resource to learners. It is essential to select material prepared by individuals of the culture that is being represented. Choosing authentic resources is an important consideration to encourage learners to be exposed to realistic situations and real life people. Here are some possible sources for listening content to explore. This is not an exhaustive list of resources. Always check the content of the resource before sharing it with learners by keeping in mind the resource selection considerations that were discussed. You can find a variety of listening texts, including authentic audio recordings on Audiolingua, videos from IDELO and l'Office national du film du Canada, audiobooks from Radio-Canada Audio, podcasts from La Puce à l'oreille and Podcast Français Facile, and programs on Zone Jeunesse, Zone des Petits, TFO, TBC Monde, and RFI Savoir. Visit the viewer's guide to access the links to these resources.
At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider this question. Thinking of the needs and identities of your learners, which resources would you seek out, and how would you frame the listening intention? By setting a purpose for listening, creating success criteria, and planning activities before, during, and after listening, FSL educators have the opportunity to use whole class and differentiated approaches that support the success of all learners. There are many ways to use differentiated instruction to support learners who might have difficulty understanding while listening in French. Using the gradual release of responsibility model, as mentioned earlier, is one way to effectively support learners with listening, as educators model listening strategies and provide opportunities for learners to practice. Some learners may need more time to process the language or to work through challenges with recalling information that they are hearing. To address these needs, educators can repeat and/or reformulate oral language for learners. They can also provide visual support, such as images, posters, sentence starters, manipulatives, and the use of a word wall to accompany oral language. Using technology can allow learners to listen to text multiple times and slow down the speed if needed to support their understanding. Educators can also provide alternative ways for learners to show their understanding. Often, learners are asked to demonstrate listening comprehension in writing, which may not be accessible for all learners. Instead, educators can provide opportunities for learners to use gestures, point to things, or draw to convey understanding. Educators can also provide access to images, drawings, or objects to help learners communicate with the rest of the class or as cues for recall. Finally, educators can differentiate content for learners based on their needs. For instance, learners might all listen to a task on the same topic, but with listening tracks that are selected with varying linguistic complexity based on learner readiness. It is important to use assessment strategies to scaffold and differentiate FSL learning contexts to address the diverse needs of learners. When educators only assess listening as a test for understanding, it can have a negative impact on learner confidence and engagement. Instead, educators need to use a variety of assessment strategies and tools to provide feedback to learners and assess their listening skills. Educators can use observation checklists during discussions, like this listening skills observation checklist from ETFO, or make anecdotal notes on learners' participation when discussing listening activities as a whole class or in small groups. For instance, observe what questions learners are asking and what predictions they can make. Educators can make time for conferences with learners about goals around listening and progress, as well as gathering evidence from directed listening activities, including learner input on graphic organizers or quizzes during listening. It is also important to involve learners in self-assessment around the development of their listening skills. Using tools like a portfolio, a listening response journal, or questions on a Google form or survey allows learners to reflect on their progress with understanding spoken French in different contexts.
At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider these questions. Identify one action you will take to effectively prepare learners for success in listening. Identify one goal for your practice that you would like to implement to support the development of learners' confidence and oral proficiency.
Your voice and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey with your team. Should you have any questions about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules were created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a nonprofit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages teachers of all programs and grade levels since 1886. Today, it continues to be the leader in professional learning and advocacy, inspiring and connecting Ontario's French and international languages educators. These modules were designed to support FSL teacher retention and recruitment by deepening the understanding of the directions, principles, and content of the Ontario curriculum policy documents for all three of the province's FSL programs: Core French, Extended French, and French Immersion. The OMLTA would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing these modules. Special thanks is also extended to the educators who contributed their expertise and experience to the development of these modules.